So thanks again for joining. For those of you who just trickled in while we were doing some announcements, my name is Courtney Burnett. I'm with the Denver Office of Emergency Management. And this is our final public meeting for Denver's Hazard Mitigation Plan update. So today you will be seeing an overview of the draft plan, all the information that we gathered from you guys over the last several months via public survey and through our comments and feedback form on our website, and a lot of really great research and analysis that our contract support team has been helping us with. So today you'll be seeing the draft of what we've put together, as well as some snapshots of the ArcGIS story map that we are putting together that will be kind of going hand in hand with this and serve as a tool to have a little bit more interaction with the plan, especially when you want the feedback. The main thing to be thinking about today when you're listening to the presentation is what feedback or thoughts or things maybe we missed that we need to include in the draft plan. We will be publishing the draft once it is ready to go so that we can get more comprehensive feedback from the public. So that will be made available. But this at least helps go over the layout of the plan, general content, kind of where things are and what our next steps are. Feel free to drop comments in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll be able to have some open discussion. We will have some time at the end for open discussion if you'd like to hold your questions until the end. But otherwise, we look forward to your feedback. And with that, I will kick it over to Scott.
Hey, thank you, Courtney. As you said, my name is Scott Field. I'm with a company called Wood Environment and Infrastructure here in Denver. I have an emergency management background, and we've been hired by the city to help facilitate the update of the city's hazard mitigation plan. On that slide that I just had was the cover of the previous plan from 2017. So we're doing a 5-year update of that plan. I'm going to go through it. I'm not going to go around the room and do full introductions, but then I'm going to talk about what the hazard mitigation planning process is, what hazard mitigation is, why it's important, and why Denver's doing it. We're going to talk about, we did a public survey a few months back. We're going to talk about the results, what we heard from that. And then I kind of introduce the structure of the updated Denver Hazard Mitigation Plan, what's in it, what are some key plan components or key parts of the plan that you might be interested in. And then I'm going to talk about this online story map that Courtney mentioned, and then talk about kind of what the next steps are and where we go from here and how you can participate going forward. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions and hopefully answers to them. So as Courtney mentioned, the main purpose of this today really is just setting you up for when this draft plan and the draft story map are available. We're trying to pique your interest now so that when they're available after the first of the year, you can go look at that and give us your feedback. So with that said, you've already met Courtney with the Office of Emergency Management. Also, David Powell, who's the deputy director there, is with us tonight. I didn't see Matt Mueller's name, who's the executive director there, but he's with us in spirit. And then there's David. And then Dan Cameron's one of our GIS specialists. He wasn't actually able to join us tonight, but Wood's a large company. We have about, well, it's a large international company, but here in Denver, we have about 6 or 7 people working specifically on this project over the last several months. So as Courtney said, do please, if you haven't already, please put your name, and if you're a member of the public, put that, or if you're from a specific organization, put that in there. But please put that in the chat if you can, so that we have a record of who all attended and so forth. And other than that, you're welcome to keep your cameras on while I'm talking if you want. It's always nice to know that there are a few people on the other end, and I'm not just me having a conversation with my laptop. So like I say, good to see at least a few familiar names on the screen. So okay, so what is hazard mitigation, and why are we doing it? And when I say we, even though I'm not a city employee anymore, I do live in Denver. So this is, in fact, pretty much our whole team lives here in Denver or in the immediate area. So it's all, this is an important plan for us as well. So when I say hazard, what I mean is anything that has the opportunity or the possibility to cause harm or damage or injure people or damage property or impact the environment. And that could be something that's naturally occurring, like a flood, a winter storm, or tornado or an earthquake. Or it could be something human caused, which could be a cyber attack, a hazardous material spill, or even a terrorist attack. And we're going to go through and talk about what all the different hazards we're looking at. But when I use the term hazard, that's what I mean. It's something that can cause damage. And then the other piece of the equation is what we call vulnerability, which is what is vulnerable? Where is the community vulnerable to those hazards? You know, if you have a flood come through and it's in an area where it doesn't damage anything, that's not a big deal, right? You still had the hazard, but it's not a disaster if nothing's damaged and no one's injured. The vulnerabilities are where the stuff that we care about, people, property, the environment, the economy, et cetera, how those can be impacted by the disaster or by the hazard, and then how they overlap. And then when we say risk, you see on this little graphic here, this red piece in the middle where those two overlap, that's what we call risk. That's where there's the potential for losses or damage. And the goal of mitigation is simply to shrink that overlap as much as possible, either by changing the nature of the hazards where we can, or where we can't, changing the nature of our assets that we care about to protect them and make them less vulnerable. So that's what I mean by that. And I'll give some specific examples here in a bit. So why is this important? Well, if you follow the news at all over the last several years, you probably have the impression that disaster costs are going up and rising, and that's very accurate. That's not just a perception, that's not just a media thing. This chart here just shows the number of billion-dollar disasters last year in 2020, and this is just natural disasters. This doesn't even include COVID, but just looking at hurricanes and severe weather and wildfires, each one of these dots costs over $1 billion in response and recovery costs. Something that used to be pretty rare, I mean, even accounting for inflation, but you can see just how many of them we've had just in the last year. Looking back further, going back really 40 years, you can see the trend. Each of these, this shows again the number of billion-dollar disasters each year. And you can see even in the 80s and 90s, which don't seem like they were that long ago, billion-dollar events were pretty rare. You'd have a handful a year and that's it. Now, we're having a slow year is one where we only have 10. And this is adjusted for inflation. So it's not just the costs are going up. We're just having a lot more disasters. And again, this is from the National Weather Service, so it's only looking at weather-related data or weather-related disasters, but it does include wildfires as well. And so you can see that they really have gone up in recent years. So why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is simply more people, and that's not specific here to Colorado, but obviously you see the problem here, but the issue of a lot more people coming here and moving in. Our communities are growing, our population is growing, and part of that translates to more people who are living in hazardous areas, whether that's specifically in some place like a floodplain or a wildland urban interface, or just in generally, we're all exposed to certain weather hazards. Along with more people, and that greater exposure to risk also comes more buildings, more infrastructure, more utilities, and those all become vulnerable to hazards as well. Also, all that stuff costs more than it used to. Inflation aside, just the cost of building materials has gone up. And another thing that part of why infrastructure costs have gone up is we've gotten much better at building more resilient infrastructure. That's the good news. If I were to show you the chart of fatalities or injuries in natural disasters over the years, it would have been the opposite of that chart I showed you. It's actually gone down over the past several decades, which is good news because we've gotten better at spending money to build better buildings that are less likely to fall over, infrastructure that's less likely to fail and less likely to hurt people. So that's great news from a public life safety standpoint, but all that stuff does cost money to build. So stuff's more expensive. And yes, we're definitely seeing, again, if you follow the news, we're definitely seeing more severe storms more frequently, more severe. A 100-year storm seems like we get one about every 4 or 5 years now. Another factor is the way, particularly when you get these large disasters, they have a tendency to create their own disasters. You have these spillover effects or carry-on effects. The classic example is we have a drought for a few years. So everything gets really dried out, and now we have an increased wildfire risk. Then we have a fire. The fire leaves a burn scar up in the mountains, and that creates an area that's going to flood more likely. So we're going to have more floods, or going to have landslides in that area. That in turn is going to cause increased erosion and sediment deposition. So all of these additional events start cascading into one another. So it's kind of not a catch-22, but the more you have, the more disasters you have, the more disasters they tend to generate. So obviously it's something that the local government and city and county very much treat as a priority. Obviously there's a legal and moral responsibility to protect the people and property in Denver. But also just these increasing costs from those previous slides I showed you are just, it's just too much money nationally. This is not just a local problem. The cost of not doing mitigation, the cost of doing nothing is too much. If we continue on the road we're on, we won't be able to afford to recover from all these disasters. A lot of these disasters are, to an extent, predictable and repetitive. I can't tell you exactly when we're going to have the next flood or when a tornado will touch down or exactly where, but we can generally have a pretty good idea of where the flooding tends to happen. We generally know how strong tornadoes are when they form in the Denver area, and there are things we can do to reduce losses from those. This is stuff that's been tested both locally and across the country. It's all stuff that works. It's all very cost effective. A lot of these are designed specifically to be environmentally sound and to reinforce nature rather than working against it. And there is money available to help with those costs as well. And I'll get to that here in a second. The bottom line is, what's shown here is this kind of like this repetitive loop of disasters where, you may sometimes get the sense that like every time we have a disaster, then we rebuild and have another disaster and then rebuild from that. And we just keep having the same cycle over and over. It's like, the old Monty Python skit where the guy builds the castle in the swamp and it sinks into the swamp. So he builds another one in the same place and it sinks in the swamp. So he builds a third and that one falls, catches fire, falls over and then sinks in the swamp. We want to break that cycle. Okay, the idea of mitigation is to keep that from happening. So we're not just rebuilding the same way every time, we're building back better. It's not a political comment, but from a hazard mitigation standpoint, that's what we want to do, is build back better so that we're not having the same disasters over and over again. I mentioned that these projects or these type of activities are very cost effective. And this chart shows the most recent study on this was from the National Institute of Building Sciences in 2019. And what it found was, I know there's a lot of numbers on here, but the bottom line of this is that for every, if you look over here in the top right, and they looked at all federal grants that were spent on hazard mitigation, and they found that for every dollar spent on mitigation, we saved $6 in response and recovery costs. And that's a pretty good investment. If I told you that if you paid me $1 today, I'd give you $6 tomorrow, you'd probably take me up on that. The numbers do vary depending on the type of activity. And you can see here based on the type of hazards, like earthquake protection is hugely cost effective in some categories. Flooding is hugely effective. Things like wildfire mitigation is a little less so because they tend to be things like fuels clearing, and forest thinning tends to be something you have to redo every couple of years. It's not kind of a one and done project, but even there, we're looking at 3 or 4 to 1 return. So it makes financial sense to do it, even if it wasn't true for all the other stuff wasn't true. It's still just there's a strong economic case for doing these. So another reason that we do this is, I mentioned there's funding available. There's a number of grants that are available from the federal government, FEMA, and several other agencies. And in order to be eligible for those grants, you have to have a mitigation plan in place that's been approved by FEMA and is updated every 5 years. So again, this is the picture of the existing plan or the old plan that we're in the process of updating. And the purpose of this plan, other than it's not just to be available to make sure the city is available for grant funding, although obviously we want to make sure that that's available. But really the intent of this plan is to have a coherent and logical and thought out framework that coordinates all the different mitigation activities that are going on in the city. So it's not every department doing their own thing, so that it's coordinated. We're all playing on the same page. We're all looking at the same hazards and thinking of similar solutions or coordinating our solutions. We want to make sure that mitigation is something that isn't just done in a silo. Again, that it's not just part of this plan update process, but that it's done throughout other programs across the city and to include our stakeholders and the private sector and all of that. It helps guide future development. Where do we want to encourage future development? Where might we want to limit future development or change the way in which we develop in certain areas? And again, the bottom line is to reduce losses and make the city more disaster resilient. That's kind of the bottom line of this whole plan. So there's a whole planning process. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. If you attended our first public meeting a few months back, I went into a few more details, but this is the one slide summary. It's just basically a 4-phase process. First phase is getting organized or getting the band back together stage, if you will. This is when we look at who was part of this process 5 years ago. And get those people back at the table where we can, or if their replacement, if they've moved on, as well as looking at who wasn't at the table 5 years ago that needs to be here now. What's the planning area? Who's the planning team and all that? One of or a couple of the changes we're making for that in this year's plan is we're specifically, in addition to the city and county of Denver as an entity, Denver Water is also participating as kind of their own entity, and the reason for that is so that they are also eligible for these federal grants on their own. And we're also taking, whereas the last plan really just focused on the city and county of Denver, this time we're taking a little bit broader look and looking at the Denver Mountain Parks and other important resources and facilities outside of the city limits that are still very important to the city, both economically and from an environmental standpoint and everything. So we're looking at a few things outside of just the city limits. Phase 2 is the risk assessment. That's where we look at what are the hazards that can potentially impact us. And where are we vulnerable to those hazards? It goes back to that risk equation of what are the hazards, where are vulnerabilities, and where do they overlap? Phase 3 is the what are we going to do about it stage. Now that we've identified all this stuff that can go wrong, this is the let's identify some goals, objectives, and strategies that we can look at to reduce those losses, which again is really the bottom line of this whole plan, is to reduce losses from future hazard events. And by the way, I say hazard events rather than disasters, because in emergency management, the word disaster is generally reserved specifically for if you have a disaster declaration. A lot of the hazard events we're talking about here are not nearly large enough to raise to that level. They're not that big an incident, but we still can't, the losses from those really add up. So we still want to look at those. So don't just be thinking of the huge, massive disasters. We're also thinking of just like the routine flooding that we get a couple of times a year and so forth. And then this last phase is adopting and implementing the plan. And this is really a critical step. So at the end, once the plan's done and we've gotten feedback from the public and everything, the plan will be approved by FEMA, and then it will go to the mayor and city council for adoption, be formally adopted. And then the goal, that's the part where I as a consultant go home, but OEM now picks up the plan and keeps moving forward with it, because what we don't want this plan to be just something that sits on a binder in a 3-ring shelf and looks pretty for 5 years. We want it to be something that's actually used. And OEM's been very good over the last 5 years since the last plan update of meeting annually to review the plan, check on status of the different mitigation projects and so forth. So we want to make sure that that is continued going forward. And again, do everything we can to make Denver a more safer and resilient community. So that's pretty much it for the process. Like I said, I'm not going to spend too much more detail. If you're curious about that, there's a whole section in the plan that details in really like gory detail down to the ninoid of every meeting we had and who attended and all that. So there'll be all that documentation in the plan if you want to dig further into that. What I want to talk about now, and we mentioned this earlier, we did a public survey a few months back. August to September, that seems like a long way away now. We put this plan out online. I don't know how many of you participated in that, but we had 206 responses, which is not bad. And we asked folks a bunch of questions about different hazards. And one of the first ones we asked is we asked everyone who responded to rate these different hazards. And we listed all these hazards here. Sorry, that's me pointing at my monitor like you can see what I'm pointing at. I tend to do that. But all these hazards that are on your screen, we asked folks to rank them So red means that is how many people rated that hazard as high significance. Yellow is how many people ranked it as medium significance, and then green is who ranked it as lowest or as low significance. So you can see the ones that came up at the top. Drought, always a concern here in Colorado, definitely. Human disease, I can't imagine why that's on everyone's mind right now. Cyber attack, definitely something that's been in the news lately. Wildland fires. One of the things we want to do in the plan this year is capture more of the impacts of other people's wildfires, like the impact of fire smoke on our air quality and so forth. That was mentioned in the previous plan, but we want to make sure we're capturing stuff like that. Down at the other end are some stuff that you might not think about. Space weather is things like solar flares, which have the potential to impact or affect telecommunications and the power grid. Expansive soils and subsidence, people don't think of that as a disaster, but they can, over time, cause a fair amount of damage. So it's something that the city wants to look at and make sure that we're planning for. Earthquake, most people, you can see it, people don't think about earthquake in Denver much. We are susceptible to earthquakes. We don't have them very often. That's the good news. But if and when we do have one again, it could potentially cause a lot of damage. And then volcanic ash, again, this is another one of those kind of, you sometimes hear them called black swan events or high probability or low probability, high consequence. But what would be the impacts of a major volcanic eruption somewhere else that throws a bunch of smoke our way? So we're trying to look at not just our hazard, but what are the impacts on us from other hazards? Another question we asked was, okay, what do you think we should be doing about it? What do you as the public think are the mitigation activities that the city should be focused on? And I'm not going to read all of these to you here, but stuff like water conservation, generators and microgrids, very popular. Incentives for renewable energy was good. Forest health and watershed protection. I love seeing that people in the metro area understand that forest health upstream affects us and affects our water quality. So that's wonderful to see. And of course, public health detection and education. You'll see some stuff on the lower end, like dam safety improvements, flood-prone property buyouts, flood insurance, education. Also important stuff, but at least in the eyes of the public, maybe not as high a priority as some of the other things. So what we did with this information, and you'll see in the plan where we've gone and we've ranked the hazards based on our analysis and based on the experience of the planning team members. And we took the public's results into account as we were figuring that out. So, if, for example, we looked at, go back up here. So say, for example, if we think dam failure is a higher hazard than the public ranked it, okay, is that because maybe we need to get do some additional outreach and put some information out so that people understand the hazard better, or same for earthquakes. On the other hand, say, hypothetically, we think one of these higher ones is not as big a deal. Well, does the public know something we don't? Are we overlooking things? Is it, if we think it's not important, but everybody in the public does, that should be a clue. So we look on that. So we've taken these into account as the planning team has gone and ranked and prioritized all these hazards. And then similarly, as we were developing mitigation projects and actions, looking at this list helped guide, was used as input to see, okay, well, what kind of stuff are we doing? Are we addressing any of these high ranked projects? So now I'm going to go through and just give you an outline of the plan. I'm not going to go into a ton of depth here, but I just want you to get a sense of what's in the plan so that when it is available for comment, you have a sense of what you're looking at and what are the parts you care about. It's broken up into 6 chapters, and then there's going to be one annex for all of Denver Water's stuff where we kind of pulled them out and kept the stuff that's specific to their facilities and assets in one place for them. And then there's a number of appendices with additional details and data. So if you really want to, if you're curious, part of this is also meant to be a reference. So if you're really curious about how many hailstorms has the city and county of Denver had, you can dig into these. All that data is in there. And there's a lot of additional information in the appendices. But I'm going to go through each of these 6 sections here real quickly. So the introduction section basically is just what it sounds like. What is this plan? What is it doing? Why are we doing it? And why is it important? A lot of what the stuff that I just talked about. It's the justification and the overview. If you only have time to read the executive summary of the plan, that's what it's for. So, and you can give us your thoughts based on that. But it does kind of lay out what the scope of the plan is and what it is not. For one thing, it's not really meant to be, it's not a response plan. It really is focused on these mitigation loss reduction activities. And then it lays out the organization here like this. It's kind of the summary of the entire plan. Section 2 is where we get into a profile of the city and county of Denver. And we talk about all, go look at all these different categories. Some of which is publicly, well, it's all publicly available information, but looking at different things on, what's our geography and climate like. I don't need to read the list to you, but we go and look at all these things because then this is the list of stuff that we're trying to protect in the later chapters. This last bullet here, the capabilities assessment, is looks at what procedures or what capabilities the city already has in place to do hazard mitigation, both from a planning standpoint, what plans, regulations, and programs are in place, what kind of staffing do the key agencies have, and are there any shortfalls there? What are the financial tools that are available, and do we know how to use them, and all of that? What are the public outreach mechanisms that are in place? So part of that is an inventory of what's available, but also to try and identify where there are any gaps that that we might need to focus on going forward. And this, as I mentioned, is just details the planning process in great detail. It talks about this is the latest in a series of plan updates going back to 2010, and what's changed since then, what's new in the plan, and where I showed you the simplified 4-step process in the previous slide. There's a longer and more involved 10-step planning process that just goes into more detail. So again, if you're curious how this happened and how this all came about, that this section is for you. Mostly it's for FEMA so that they can say we met all the requirements for the plan update. And then we get into the risk assessment. And this is about half the plan. It's the thickest section of the plan, and it's got the most technical detail in it as well. So it's a pretty detailed section. And again, you can read in as much depth as you want to, but this is where we talk about, we identify the different hazards that are of concern to Denver and which ones we're looking at and which ones were, if there are any that were not, because we felt like they're not a significant hazard, why they made that decision. And then again, for each of those hazards, has a hazard profile section that describes, okay, what are we talking about? When we talk about flooding, are we talking just riverine flooding? Or are we also talking street flooding? The answer to that is yes, we're looking at both, by the way. Then it breaks through, what are the, where is it likely happen? For something like flooding, where do we typically see, where are the designated or the mapped floodplains, as well as just the areas in the city that we know flood every time we get a lot of rain. We identify those, what's in those areas that's vulnerable, how much, what is the typical magnitude or severity of each event, at considerations like that. And then we'll do a detailed analysis where possible of what all is vulnerable to it. So I mentioned floodplains being kind of an easy one. We'll look at what structures are located in these these habitually flooded areas. How many people live in floodplain areas or that are at risk of flood flooding? What critical facilities and infrastructure is located in areas that are at an increased risk? And then that then helps to drive, wow, we should really do something to focus on those. So these, so the profiles are where we really get into the meat of each of the different hazards. I will note, I didn't have a specific slide on this. I'll talk about it here in a little bit, but we do not, for purposes of this plan, we don't profile climate change as its own hazard. The city already has a climate adaptation plan and a climate action plan, and we don't need to duplicate that, although we want to make sure that is all integrated into the plan. But what we do is we look at what are the potential impacts of climate change on each of these hazards, and how is, based on the best available science to date, what is the thinking on how climate change may impact both the frequency of hazard events as well as the severity of hazard events, how how is the future not going to look like the past? So that's a section in each of these hazards of how climate change is going to affect those. And then the mitigation strategy section, again, this is the what are we going to do about it? It starts off with the overall goals and objectives that the city's adopted. We talk about how we identified mitigation actions, what's been done on the actions that were identified in the last plan. And then the mitigation action plan is just a list of projects that the city wants to do. It's a long list, and some of them will be able to get funded and some won't, but it's to try and make as comprehensive a list of things as possible. And then, as I mentioned, the implementation and maintenance section is really important because we really do want this to be a living plan that is useful to the city going forward and isn't just a one and done thing that you paid a contractor to do and then it's going to sit on the shelf. So this lays out again, not only how the plan will be monitored and updated going forward, but how the information in this plan can be used to inform other planning documents like the city's comprehensive plan, capital improvements plan, other things of that nature. All right, now I'm just going to go through and I'm going to hit a few key highlights that are in the plan, just of things that you might find interesting or things that you might want to go look at when the plan comes out. Excuse me while I. So one of the things we look at for when we talk about hazard events and disasters is we do look at what are the past disasters that have impacted Denver. And this is the list of all the federal disaster declarations that have included Denver, going back to 1953 when they started doing formal disaster declarations. You see, we've had 11 of them. Most of them are from weather events. We've had 4 floods. Or 4 flooding events that were significant enough to count as to be declared a federal disaster. Some snowstorms, a tornado. We have 1 fire declaration. The 2 biological events are both for the current COVID pandemic. It was an emergency declaration and then a disaster declaration, which are slightly different. I'm not going to go into the explanation of those. And then everyone wants to know how on earth we got a hurricane declaration in Denver. That's actually from Hurricane Katrina. Because Denver assisted with taking in evacuees and refugees from the Gulf Coast. So we were included in that disaster declaration to help take care of those people. And you'll see that's actually one of the sections in the plan is how we would do that. So obviously this isn't a comprehensive list, but it's a pretty good thing of going back over the last half century or more of what are the big stuff that has tended to cause damage in Denver. So I mentioned, we have a list of hazards that we're looking at, and this is the list. So this is all the hazards that are going to be profiled in the plan. I'm not going to go through and read this whole list to you, but you can see it's a pretty good mix of both natural hazards as well as human-caused hazards. There's a lot of these that are stuff that Denver's really leaning forward on, things like, a lot of people look at infrastructure failure, but also supply chain interruptions. That's a real emerging field in emergency management. And, we've all experienced over the last few years just how easily it is to disrupt our supply chain. So I commend OEM for including that on the list of things to look at. Like I said, I'm not going to go through this whole list here, but there's a lot of events like volcano ash or volcanic ash from someone else's eruption, looking at what that impact could have on us, mass influx of evacuees, like we just mentioned from Katrina. Somebody else is having a bad day and we're trying to help. We better have a plan for how to do that. What can we do to make that process less painful on our end for us and for them? So these are all the different hazards. And when you get the draft plan, you'll be able to go through and look at each of these, or at least all of the ones that interest you. See what you think, hopefully learn a few things, and hopefully teach us a few things, because again, we really do want your experience and input on this plan. So I mentioned the mitigation strategy starts with goals. These are the 4 goals that the planning team has adopted. The first 3 were from the 2017 plan and have just been readopted as is. But this 4th one is something that was specifically added this year, looking at equity and looking at vulnerable communities and historically marginalized communities. That's something that, as I'm sure you're aware, is a very big issue for both Mayor Hancock and council. It was implied, I would say, in the goals of the previous plan, but it's something that is important enough that everyone felt real strongly about calling that out as that being a specific goal for this time around. Which is a great lead into my next slide. One of the things that the previous plan did look at, but something we really want to get further down in the weeds on this time is social vulnerability or social equity. And what we mean by that is whenever there's a disaster or a significant event, there are always certain people there's some people are going to be more impacted by that disaster than others, either because they don't have the financial resources to recover or respond from it, or because maybe there's a language issue where we need to make sure that we're putting notifications out in languages that people speak, as our interpreter referenced earlier. Or maybe there's some people who don't have cars. There's a lot of people in Denver that don't have cars now. That's great, but then they can't self-evacuate. We can't trust them to hop in their car and get out of town or get out of the neighborhood when there's an incident. Means the city has to make sure they have a plan for that, for how we're going to help those people. So all this stuff, and I'm not even going to go through the details here. This is actually straight off of the city's website. If you wanted to go, you could go look at this right now of the different categories that the city looks at, and it's again everything from income, physical and mental disabilities, language barriers or language proficiency, race, again income, housing conditions. Availability of resources. What we're trying to do here is identify who might need extra help during disaster, or where are the structural barriers that are going to make this disaster harder from some people, so that we can identify that and try and reduce those barriers. So there's going to be a lot more analysis and detailed analysis on this in the plan. An example of that is something we're looking at is with the city is tree canopy coverage. You're looking at what are the neighborhoods that have less, have more tree canopy and which have less. It'll probably won't shock you to learn the neighborhoods with less tree canopy tend to be poorer, tend to be less financially resilient. And that does become a catch-22 because the lack of tree canopy, in addition to some mental health benefits and other benefits, it tends to increase the effects of extreme heat. Which then drives up utility usage, air conditioning costs, can have public health impacts. So that's just one example where we're not just looking at where do we need to plant trees, but what are the poorer neighborhoods that need more trees more than some other neighborhoods. So anyway, the plan is going to go into a lot more detail on that, but just that is something that the city wanted to look at in a lot more detail this time. So we've tried to do that. So then we're going to have a list, as I said, of the different types of mitigation activities or actions, the stuff that we want to do to try and lower these risks. And it can be anything from making sure we've adopted the latest building codes, or that our floodplain regulations are adequate and modern. It could be something like you'll see a lot of physical infrastructure projects. This intersection floods every year. We need a bigger culvert there, or we need a bigger drain outlet, stuff of that nature. In some cases, we don't see this too much here in Denver, but you'll see it in a lot of other communities where, we're just going to buy out properties. If there's a spot in a floodplain, we're just going to buy it out and move this guy's house up the hill a little bit where they're not going to get flooded out, and turn that area into green space, where there again, the area is still going to flood, but we've removed the vulnerability to that flooding because there's not somebody in there. Also, natural systems protection could be anything like forest fuels thinning of trees. Again, particularly we're looking for there, like around the Denver mountain parks and other resources like red rocks and so forth. But also natural systems can mean anything to include aquifer recharge here in the city, anything where we're trying to work with nature and help restore nature to help protect us rather than working against it. And there's a lot of overlap between these categories, obviously. This is the list as it currently stands. It won't be the final numbers, but just the number of different actions of mitigation activities that have been identified for each hazard on that list. You can see we have a ton of flood projects, a lot of severe weather projects, So infrastructure and supply chain interruption have a lot of great projects addressing that. Some of the others we're looking at, and don't take these numbers too seriously, because like these cyber incident, it's only 5 actions, but one of those actions is a couple pages long and has a lot of stuff in it. But this just shows kind of the variety of different types of actions that we're looking at. There were 24 actions that from the previous plan that weren't completed and are being carried over into this plan. Some of those just didn't have the funding to do. Some of it the city didn't get to it. All of these are a prioritization. The previous plan didn't expect that they would finish all of the actions in 5 years, and I certainly don't expect that we'll finish all of these in the next 5 years. But it's about identifying stuff and prioritizing things, particularly so that if grant funds do suddenly become available, you've got a list of stuff you can look at that's, oh yeah, we've got a project for that. And then again, in terms of implementation and maintenance, there'll be some procedures there on how the planning committee, the mitigation planning committee, is going to meet going forward, what they're going to do, what they're going to be looking at, and really importantly, how we want to keep the public involved throughout that process. So there will be public outreach, both in terms of reaching out to the public to give information and tell you what's going on, as well as getting input from the public on what's going on. We want that to be a two-way street. So that's going to be a section of the plan that you might want to look at too, just so you have a sense of how mitigation is going to be continued going forward. And again, in another 5 years, it'll be time to update it again. Okay, so I've talked about the plan a lot and talked about you reviewing the plan. I'm going to warn you now that when this plan comes out, and if you download it, and hopefully you look at it before sending it to the printer, because it's several hundred pages. Okay, these are not light plans. This is a thick technical document that goes into a lot of detail, which is great, but it's not a light read. I'm not gonna lie to you. There's a lot of information in there. We want to make the information in the plan more accessible to people who aren't, hazard nerds like me. So one of the things that we're working with the city and the city's GIS department to develop is an online story map that basically looks at the different hazards. It's essentially taking the information in the plan, taking that information, putting it in a more easy to understand and presentable format, and putting it on the internet where everyone can look at it. And it'll start with general information. If you just want the 5-minute version, great, here's that. Click here if you want the hour-long version. And if you really want the more detail, click here to go look at and read the whole plan. So you can kind of get as far down the rabbit hole as you want to go. But if you have any familiarity with story maps, you've seen them in any other context, this is, basically it's just a way of presenting information. A lot of the information is going to be designed around maps, and that's most of what I'm going to show you today. But for some of these hazards, there's not really a lot of there may not be a mapping element. For example, for things like severe winter storms, we could show you a map of where winter storms happen, but it's the whole region. They don't tend to be localized events, but we'll still have a tab that talks about winter storms, talks again, going through kind of the summary version of what is most likely to happen in Denver, how often do we get, what constitutes a snow emergency in Denver, and then what are the things you can do to keep your family, your property, your community safe from each of these hazards. So this one's looking at local flooding. There's 2 types of flooding here. Just briefly, the plan will go into more detail. FEMA flooding is looking at really riverine flooding. It's looking at when the Platte River or the Cherry Creek get out of their banks and start flooding places. And those are regulatory maps of this is the floodplain, and if you live in this area, you have to buy flood insurance. So that's great. That's all good information. This is a little bit different. This is where we're looking at localized flooding or just street flooding or flash flooding that you're familiar with. Again, anytime our storm system or stormwater system in this city is pretty good, but it was built a long time ago. And for some of these really large events, we get 8 inches of rain and Broadway is a river. So we're going to look at these areas that flood, where it's just streets, where it's actually going to get into properties and potentially buildings. This isn't regulatory mapping, but it's helps identify from the city's perspective, what are the areas we need to protect. But from your perspective, you'll be able to enter your address and it'll pop up and tell you which hazards you need to be worried about for your home or your business or whatever. And you can look here and say, okay, if you're at this spot right here, once, an average of every 100 years, which don't put stock in that it won't happen for another 100 years. What it really translates to is about a 1% chance every year of it happening. And you get a flood depth of about a foot, about 1.1 foot at whatever area or for your specific building. And you'll be able to see how that varies. And that may give some ideas that you can do for mitigation in your area to keep that 1 foot of water out of your house or out of your basement when it does come. This looks at the floodplain mapping. This is that regulatory, FEMA mapping that I talked about earlier. Each of these dots is a structure that's located in, this is the 1% or that 100-year floodplain. And there's different zones. You can see here, it explains all of those. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but what this does is allows us to see, again, what properties and facilities are potentially at risk. Breaks it down here by residential, commercial, if they're outbuildings, garages, or sheds, as opposed to houses. What do we have that we need to be worried about? Another example, I love this map, it's very, very colorful. This is the dam inundation mapping and I know this looks a little scary, but this is basically if every dam in the metro area failed all at once, it would be a very bad day. You probably didn't need to hire a contractor to tell you that. But what this does is for each of the different dams, particularly the major ones, you can see Cherry Creek and Chatfield and Sinac and a few others. If that dam were to fail completely, where would that water potentially go and what would that look like? Dam failures are incredibly rare, and none of this should be taken to imply that we're worried that Cherry Creek Dam is going to fail or that that's something that's imminent. But it is something we need to be aware of because especially, and we saw this in 2013 with the flooding there, even if you have enough flooding upstream, the dam may be perfectly fine, but they're putting a lot of water over the spillway that can still cause flooding downstream, even though it's not a dam failure per se. So we want to know where these potential inundation areas are. Again, it's similar to flooding. You want to know what the potential risks are for these different areas. And you can see it breaks down here. You'll be able to turn on and off. So if you only want to look at Bear Creek, or you can toggle these different dam layers on and off. But you can see that it is, considering that this was one of the lowest hazards of concern in the public survey. I'm not sure how many of those people know that they're living in 5 overlapping dam inundation areas. But again, this is definitely falls in the category of very rare, low probability events. But if it does happen, it could be a very bad day. So there's a number of other maps like this. And again, for each of the hazards, there's going to be additional references and material. Here are the data sources. If you want to get in and get your hands dirty and look at the actual data and go into more detail, each of these is going to come with information on, again, possible actions you can do to protect yourself and your community, and where you can go to get more information, both, if you want to go into the hazard mitigation plan itself, as well as other online resources and FEMA sites. There's a ton of information out there. The Mile High Flood District has a wealth of information. We don't need to duplicate all that. We just need to point you to it. So what we're hoping is that this will be a much more a widely used tool, and it'll be updated regularly as the mitigation plan is updated or as new data comes in. Once all of this once the setup is built on the city's system, then updating each individual layer, new floodplains come out and boom, it's updated automatically. So we think this is going to be a very useful tool, both for the city from an emergency management and a planning standpoint, but also, and probably more importantly, to help the public understand what the hazards are, what the relative risk from each of those hazards are, and what are the things you can do to protect yourself. Okay, getting to the end of the slideshow, and then I'll give my voice a rest and see what kind of questions you have. So as I said, the next thing that we're going to be coming out is the draft mitigation plan and the story map. We want to have both of those out at the same time. We anticipate that coming out sometime after the first of the year. When that when that does come out, we'll let you know. However you learned about today's meeting is probably is how you will learn about when the plan is available. If you don't already follow OEM on social media, please do. Or if you want to make sure you're on the mailing list and you're not sure if we have your email address, please feel free to type it into the chat or reach out to Courtney or myself afterwards. You can the city's webpage. If you go to denvergov.org/OEM for Office of Emergency Management, you can go to the mitigation page there, and it'll have the whole process of where we're at. And once it's released, we'll have links to both the plan and to the story map itself, and then a comment form. And it's a very open-ended comment form. We're just going to say, tell us what you think. And that can be as broad or as detailed as you want it to be. I promise we're going to read every single comment. And we typically get, we have gotten some very good feedback. Oh, thank you, Courtney. You just put the link in the chat there. We get, my company does a lot of hazard mitigation plans around the country, and we typically get some really good feedback from public comments. So if there's something in there that doesn't seem right to you, or that you have particular knowledge on, or just that, hey, you think this should be a higher priority, or should be more focused on this thing based on your experience, tell us that. If we got something wrong, if we confused Barnum with Berkeley, like I did the other day, not in the plan, but just driving around. Let us know that, if there are errors in the plan, we want to catch those. And again, if there's anything we can do to make this plan stronger, we want to make sure we do that. So please give us your feedback. Again, it's going to be a very open-ended form. Just tell us whatever you think. And if it's down to specifically on page 312, there's a typo, great, we'll take that. We want to fix those too. But if you also just have broader comments about what you're concerned about from a hazards standpoint, let us know. This is your chance to have your voice heard. Okay, so that is all I have for my presentation. So I think we're just gonna open it up to questions. And I saw Councilwoman Ortega is on the call, so
yeah, she actually just dropped a question in the chat.
Oh, there we go.
What are the implications to Denver if we don't submit a hazard mitigation plan, or we identify hazards or vulnerabilities, but take no steps to address those issues?
No, that's a great question, ma'am. So the implications if Denver doesn't submit a hazard mitigation plan is we would not be eligible for FEMA hazard mitigation funds. It doesn't necessarily, or it doesn't impact other federal programs. It doesn't impact post-disaster recovery funds. What it does is impact the hazard mitigation assistance program grants that FEMA has. So that's all, but that's a lot. Particularly now, something that has happened over the last couple of years is the last couple of administrations have really increased funding for hazard mitigation. There's a lot of money available, as well as now they've made hazard mitigation grant. HMGP, it's a hazard mitigation grant program, which is a post-disaster mitigation program, is available now to all states, including Colorado, as a result of the COVID pandemic. Funds don't necessarily have to be spent specifically on public health stuff. It can be for any hazard reduction. So that's the short version is if we don't submit an updated plan, we're not eligible for those funds until it is submitted. If there's
Scott, just a quick question. Are there preventative dollars available on the front end?
Absolutely, yes. There's, like I said, I mentioned HMGP, which is post-disaster, but there's also the new one, used to be called the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Fund, but they've rebranded that as BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. And it is a pre-disaster fund that is funded, something they did, and this is getting a little down on the weeds, but PDM was never funded very well because there's always like, whenever anyone was looking to cut the budget, that was always an easy target. What they've done now is the funding for BRIC is based on a formula of however much we spent on disasters last year, we're going to set aside a percentage of that for mitigation going forward. And that's all pre-disaster. And there's a lot of money available for that right now. Both this
we need to tap into that for our railroad planning stuff that we're trying to address to ensure that we've got the right tools in place for our city as we continue to approve development next to rail that is not addressing life safety issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know I'm obviously familiar with the issues you're talking about. We have tried to capture that in the plan. David or Courtney, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
I'll just say, yeah, we're definitely aware of that initiative and that item in the budget this year, and that's something we intend to address in some of our mitigation actions as well. You know, Councilwoman Ortega, we definitely want to make sure we stay coordinated with you as far as any other mitigation funding we can go for to help with any of those projects.
Yeah, I don't know if Jack is on the call, but Jack from my office and I have been working with the mayor's office, and we have some funding. It's not the amount that we requested and that we were told by the folks who did the same effort in Canada that we actually need. So we think that's going to have to be augmented for us to do a quality job in truly addressing this issue. So just wanted to share that and appreciate the fact that this plan does include hazardous materials and the transport of those, which, you know, absolutely ties into this whole railroad safety component.
Absolutely.
And one thing, a lot of the traditional FEMA funding is very much natural hazards focused, and that really is a requirement for the plan is to focus on natural hazards. We were sure to expand that to other hazards such as hazardous materials as well, because we wanted that full picture and didn't want to leave out any of the hazards that might not be the traditional natural hazards. So those are included in the plan as well. Absolutely.
Well,
yeah, that's much appreciated. So thank you all for your work in putting this together and doing the public outreach.
Thank you. I should note too also, ma'am, as far as the local funding that's already been available, most of the FEMA mitigation grants require a local match, typically 25%, although it can vary. So a good way to think of these grants is kind of as a multiplier. You know, if you have however much funding you have available, that's the local match you can put forward. You can potentially get 3 times that in federal grants. So.
That's awesome, because we already have our match available.
Good. Yeah, that's perfect. You don't have to figure out where that's going to come from. Other questions? Sorry for late introduction. I don't see anything else in the chat. If anybody else has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just, like I say, it's a fairly small group. Good to see a pretty good turnout, 20 people. Feel free, you can raise your hand, or just like I said, just if you want to unmute or turn your camera on or whatever and ask a question, or if you're more comfortable typing into the chat, that's fine too. Questions or comments? Nobody has any thoughts. I've been for an hour and no one has any questions or thoughts. Come on.
This is Jan Mares from the Barnum neighborhood.
Yes, Jan.
I have a question for you. Within your plan documents, is there information on how the RNOs can go about, how do we access hazard mitigation monies? Our neighborhood happens to have a lot of trees, but a lot of them are dead. People don't have the money to remove them. And with the windstorm that we're looking at having tomorrow, we could have a hazard day tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. I'll let David or Courtney talk to specifics, but as far as the plan in general, we do address the RNOs, and that's registered neighborhood organizations for anyone else that might not know. We do address those, and you'd potentially be eligible for funding through the city. It would be the city that would have to apply for the funding, in cooperation with one of the RNOs. So yeah, that's something that is very definitely available. And one of the things that I think makes Denver so strong is that we have a lot of strong neighborhoods that look at stuff like that. So very much want to look at, it would be great to, I mean, if every RNO took this plan and looked at, okay, what are the hazards specifically for our neighborhood? Wow, talk about making a strong community. So yes, now that you've said that, I want to go back and look at the plan and make sure that because as you say, I'm thinking of a few other places we can integrate that. So I'm really glad you brought it up, but we'll make sure we include that in the plan. It's already addressed, but I think I might go beef that up now as I'm thinking it through. So thank you.
And just to add to what Scott said, in the past, we have had, have looked at tree management, especially the trees that are in the right of way or in the public sphere, and making sure that there's a program, Parks manages manages that. But to Scott's point, we definitely encourage everyone to take the plan back, take it to your RNOs or your community, look through it. And if there's things specific, like for example, if you feel in your neighborhood, the tree maintenance could be an issue with the high winds like we're expecting tomorrow, which is a great point. We want to make sure we capture that in the plan. And that's something that once it's in the plan, then we can look at options to see if there are funding opportunities on the road to expand any of the existing programs or do new projects.
And that's a great point too, David. I've said a couple of times that the plan is going to do a full update every 5 years, but the plan can be updated at any point between now and then, and will be. One of that's part of that whole implementation and maintenance part. So for example, the plan comes out and you get together with your neighbors there and decide that, hey, there's a project that we need to do in this neighborhood that's not in the plan. You talk to OEM, they basically generate an amendment and boom, now it's in the plan. And once it's in the plan, then you become eligible for funding. So it's just, if you don't have it, this plan is not set in stone. So you're not limited to just the actions that are identified in this current plan, but because that can always be updated going forward. And we hope it will be, as some stuff gets checked off the list, some things will be completed and taken off the list. But we hope that there'll be others that will be added as, particularly once the story map goes up and people can really look at what the hazards in their area are. We're really hoping that the neighborhoods and the public in general will give the city more ideas of things to do and more ideas for projects. How long does the FEMA review take? Actually, we're lucky here in Colorado. So it goes first to the state for review, and the Colorado Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management, they're great. They usually get that review back within a few weeks, a month tops. They're very good at getting stuff turned around quickly. FEMA by statute has 45 days to get it back to us. So a month and a half. They've been running about a month. So it's it's definitely not overnight. Again, this is a thick plan. And FEMA Region 8 is responsible for 6 states, and every county in each of those states is doing a plan. So they have a lot of reading to do. But we're lucky here compared to some other regions that we've worked in. Both the state of Colorado and our FEMA region are pretty good about getting stuff turned around quickly. That's a good question. Thanks. Any other thoughts or comments? Courtney or David, what did I leave out? What did I forget to say?
I don't think you missed much. I'll just reiterate to the group that we really do want your feedback. There may be issues, just that we were just talking about in your neighborhood that haven't been brought up. And, if there's something we can get into the plan, it's for projects and for money, but it is also for that socialization piece, because once it's in the plan, and we're sharing that with our stakeholders and our partners. Money isn't the only way that we can implement some of these projects. Some of them are with current bandwidth from staff or current budgets, right? It provides an opportunity to potentially get more funding, but the sky's the limit as far as what we want to include in the plan. And I think to what we were discussing a little bit earlier, even if it's not true mitigation, but maybe it's sort of in that prevention world or in that response world, but it's just something that we want to keep our eye on as a priority to help us be better at reducing the risk or being better prepared for certain emergencies. We want it in the plan. So we really do rely on the public's input on that and folks who are subject matter experts in areas where we aren't. So when this goes out, give us your feedback, even if it's via the story map. You look through the story map, there's info in there that we can update in both the story map and the plan. Or maybe there's just one section in the plan you want to read and it's just about hazmat incidents, and get us feedback on that. We'll take it all, and we'll, as Scott mentioned, we'll get all of that out to you probably the way you heard about this, but I did drop my email in the chat, and as well as our website link, which currently has a comments box. If there's just something that occurs to you after this meeting that you're like, I wonder if they thought about this or considered this, drop that chat in there or that message in there, and we're monitoring that. And then otherwise, once we get the plan out and the story map published, there will be, more mechanisms for you to be able to submit that feedback. So and I'm hoping to get this meeting recorded as well. So if there's something that we covered really fast or anything like that, you want to go back and rewatch this, we're going to try and make that available so that it's available while you're accessing the plan. So definitely get us your feedback, even if it's just an email. We appreciate it. David, anything from you?
Reporting, Courtney, it's also a great point. If you have somebody else that you mentioned this to, and they oh, I'm sorry that I missed that. I would have found that interesting. We're going to be able to have this recording up on the hopefully on YouTube for you can. So rather than you having to repeat the entire thing to them, you can just send them a link or tell them to go Google it.
And just lastly, thank you everyone who joined. We really appreciate you joining and listening, providing your comments and questions. Hope we continue to do that with the plan that comes out. One thing I do want to say about this plan in particular, a lot of attention gets paid, and rightfully so, to disaster response and recovery. However, the best disaster response recovery is one that doesn't have to occur because we've mitigated it beforehand. And that's why this plan is so important. We want to stop things or reduce their impacts before the impacts are felt in the community. And I think that's a very important goal as we look to the future with climate change and other variables, that we just need to be very proactive with this. And so your involvement tonight and your involvement with the plan and comments is absolutely critical. And we appreciate any feedback and engagement we can get on this plan as we complete it and then go to implementing some of those action items. So thanks, Scott and Courtney, and thank you everyone for joining and participating.
Thank you all. Like I say, it was a good turnout and some great questions. So thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.